So, my presentation is on Marxism and gender and socialist feminism. To start, what is feminism? Feminism is a broader social movement aimed to establish and secure equality for all genders. In practice, feminism opposes the patriarchy and sexism and aims to uplift all genders and boost their social, political, and economic statuses to be equal to that of men. Feminism has a very broad range. It's a very broad movement, so there are a multitude of different approaches and ideologies within feminism. Feminism has been an imperative movement throughout history and still remains significantly prevalent today. Continued. There are numerous different forms of feminism stemming from all sorts of political ideologies, shared personal experiences, economic and social classes, etc. These different factors can combine to create even more unique forms, methods, and approaches of feminism. This combination of societal factors is often known as intersectionality. Next, there are here's some just different major forms of feminism to distinguish from socialist feminism versus liberal feminism, which seeks to further the feminist movement through institutional reform, like removing legal and cultural barriers through passing policies like for reproductive freedom or preventing workplace discrimination. Then socialist feminism, which briefly it views gender inequality as a product of capitalism and aims to dismantle capitalism and gender inequality together in the process of securing social and economic equality as well. Socialist feminism often believes that liberal feminism does not go far enough because it still maintains the existing institutions of power or upholds the status quo, which is capitalism, and which perpetrates these different forms of oppression. Then finally, there's radical feminism, which aims to eliminate the concept of gender entirely in the process of securing gender equality. Next, what is socialism? Socialism is a broader left-wing political and economic philosophy or practice that is characterized mainly by public or working class ownership of the means of production as opposed to the private ownership that is in capitalism. Often in Marxist and Marxist-Leninist perspectives, socialism is seen as a sort of stepping stone in the transition from capitalism to communism. That is, like in this quote from Vladimir Lenin, the goal of socialism is communism. Um, Socialism aims to give equal opportunity to education, healthcare, work, and services through eliminating social and economic barriers, and realizing a classless society. Socialism, when it's used as a stepping stone, would theoretically mainly eliminate economic barriers because social discrimination is so embedded in society. Um, then, what is Marxism? Marxism is the term used to collectively identify all of Karl Marx's works. It is a left-wing socio-economic analysis that aims to explain class relations, conflict, and social progress. Marxism theorizes that capitalism is a self-destructive system that eventually results in a revolution of the working class or the proletariat and a subsequent realization of a classless society. This classless society in practice aims to eliminate socio-economic struggles and create a society where everybody benefits based on the value of their labor and the state controls all property and wealth. I go further into detail on what value is in Marxist perspectives later on. Then, what is socialist feminism? Socialist feminism is a specific form of feminism. Socialist feminism establishes that sexism, the patriarchy, and any other contributors to gender inequality are products of a capitalist society. In this, socialist feminism aims to dismantle capitalism and gender inequality and all these other forms of oppressions together in conjunction. At its most basic form, socialist feminism is the belief that securing and protecting women's rights should be pursued in conjunction with social and economic justice. This could be part of one large, encompassing process, or theoretically as a natural result of undoing capitalism and realizing a classless society. I also go further into detail of what socialist feminism is later on as well. Uh, Marxism and gender. Marxism is often criticized for its economic determinism and how it may confound its perspectives on gender or feminism in general. Economic determinism is the belief that essentially a person's economic status determines or at least somewhat influences all of their other social or political alignments. Marx and Engels are both often separated in ideology when it comes to gender because the two have very different approaches to thought. Engels is more monistic or scientific, and Marx takes on more dialectical understandings of gender and society as a whole. Continued Marxism has also been criticized for being gender blind and in need of a separate theory for gender relations. Marxism's quote unquote stance on gender primarily exists through interpretations of gender relations through a Marxist lens or from Marxists themselves. Different Marxist feminists have created theories through Marxist lenses and applied Marxism to modern gender relations. Uh, Margaret Benston, Maria Rosa Della Costa, Silvia Federici, Wally Sacombe, they have all tried to revalue housework, as value of labor is an important aspect of Marxism. Lise Vogel has tried to move away from the traditional dual systems belief of patriarchy and capitalism to a more unitary view of production versus reproduction. The dual systems belief of patriarchy capitalism is essentially that patriarchy and capitalism are two um, coexisting entities within society. Um, it was a common form of socialist feminism and common belief in lots of other forms of socialist feminism in the 70s and 80s, and it sort of lost popularity during the fall of communism in the Soviet Union. I have here Iris Young. She argued that the dual systems theory was inadequate because it involved two different philosophical policies, with one being historical and based on social and economic development, and the other being based on a psychological or subjective view of human nature. These two policies in the same theory made it become very convoluted and caused it to lose credence among its audiences, which is why the dual systems theory is not very prevalent in socialist feminism today. Um, Nancy Holmstrom is another Marxist feminist who effectively applies Marxism to better understand the development of women's historical standings in society. So, what does Marx say about gender? Marx never really goes extremely in depth on gender, but there are segments about genders scattered across his works. In the economic and philosophical manuscripts, Marx makes his predominant claim about gender that women's position in society can be used as a measure of the quality or development of society as a whole. Marx also alludes to the idea that gender is a dynamic concept rather than a static one, or acknowledging that the idea that gender is on a spectrum and rejecting the gender binary. Um, in the German ideology, Marx and Engels criticized the gender division of labor as being unnatural, and they argue against an objective naturalness. Continued, Marx extends his criticism of women's conditions to classes outside of the working class on multiple occasions. Like, for one, in an 1846 essay, Marx sympathizes with upper class or bourgeois women victim to suicide as a result of oppressive familial conditions. Marx and Engels, they both discuss gender and labor in the German ideology that I uh, previously talked about. In the German ideology, they established that the gender division of labor is unnatural, except in physically demanding cases where it would be "quote unquote" natural for larger, stronger people to carry out those tasks, not necessarily men exclusively to do physical labor. The Communist Manifesto discusses family and property. In the Communist Manifesto, they argue that the concept of family almost is entirely disappearing among the proletariat because, unlike the bourgeois family, they have no real property or estate to pass on to their children. There were things like farmland, but natural land was expropriated and it was taken over in place for factories in cities or neighborhoods, and which erases really the property that the proletariat had to pass on to their children and uphold this concept of a family. Uh, Theoretically, this would diminish the power of the father. Um, and they basically say that the concept of a family would then diminish into something different when the father is his power is being taken away. But they really don't explicitly detail what that would be. Marx's Capital discusses gender. In Capital, Marx establishes really that workplaces have become automated, and so automation in the workplaces would require less physically demanding labor, which would open the door to women and children being targets for capitalists. Because women and children are vulnerable in society, they additionally can be compelled to work for less. Um, but also subsequently, because of women working, Marx says they are no longer under direct control of their husbands or fathers throughout most of the day, and stating that women working would alter the traditional family and be a step towards women being more equal to men. Um, Marx's critique of value, I say value with air quotes, where a person's value is only attributed really to how much they can produce, like how much money they can make their employer or other people or their company. It views value as a material, statistical concept instead of an abstract, psychological or philosophical state of being. This idea of quote unquote value being a quantitative or measurable variable value allows for Marxist feminists revaluation of women's labor and unpaid labor like housework, child rearing, etc., which I talked about earlier on with Maria Rosa Della Costa, Silvia Federici, and Margaret Benson. Um, I believe that idea of value being measurable is created by a society's ruling class that desires to normalize workers' oppression and exploitation. Um, Value being based on how much a person produces, uh, being the main form of how value is measured, uh, is sort of ingrained into workers' minds. Um, to make them accept that this repressed state of being. I think value really should be looked at as a more abstract idea, not a quantitative or measurable one, um, that is measured by things like a person's salary, but it should be an inherent quality of just being a person or by simply just existing. Um, like this value entitles you to things like, or this value that is inherent to being a person should entitle you to things like adequate healthcare, education, food, clothes, housing, fun, leisure, all that. And it also entitles you to social things like not being separated by socio or economic barriers like race, gender, sex, sexuality, or economic class. I think economic barriers wouldn't exist when you get rid of this quantitative view of value anyway, because a person's value wouldn't be based on their production, but their value is just based on their existence as a person. Um, I kind of got off topic, but next, Marx's rejection of the gender binary. The gender binary is the belief that gender is separated into two specific, distinct classifications of man and women, or masculine and feminine. Marx critiques this the traditional dualistic interpretations of nature and society. Instead, he takes a dialectical approach, when which essentially outlines that when humans interact with nature through labor, both humans and nature are changed, where humans are a part of nature and labor is providing that link from humans to nature. Um, Sorry, my recording got cut out for a second. So instead of nature and society coexisting as two distinct things, Marx looks at them as being dialectically related. He argues that there can be no objective view of what is natural. That rejective view of that rejection of objective naturalness doesn't explicitly reject the gender binary, but rejecting an objective naturalness is a fundamental aspect of rejecting the gender binary and acknowledging that gender is on a spectrum. You can apply Marx's way of thinking of this nature and society and objective naturalness to gender and likely get a similar result. And this interpretation of different Marxist works and applying it to other concepts that they don't really talk about or explicitly go into detail goes back to that quote of Marx and Engels that it's not a dogma but a guide to action. Finally, I have socialist feminism. Intersectionality is a very important facet of socialist feminism, where they acknowledge that there is a multitude of different contributors to oppression, like race, gender, sexuality, economic or social class, nationality, etc., and that these things can sort of stack onto each other and combine to uh, create a person's unique experiences. Um, they also establish that dealing with one of these without simultaneously dealing with the others is ineffective and fruitless, that it won't actually lead to like real liberation, but you will just have alleviated the pain in some form of way. Because of this, feminists deal with a full range of oppressions that's not just solely sex and gender. Socialist feminists also argue that liberal feminism is inadequate and it only addresses the issues surrounding sex and gender in the upper and middle classes, and it's disposed to ignoring a good number of those other factors. Both socialist feminism and liberal feminism do agree that women are oppressed in virtually all societies, but socialist feminism establishes that the nature of that oppression is different because of there being differing economic realities. Continued, socialist feminism believes that women's oppression isn't a sole economic issue, but that the patriarchy and capitalism are united in one system. In this, we have to understand that the economic impacts and perpetration of oppression by capitalism leads to different oppressions like racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia. Socialist feminism doesn't differentiate oppression in place for one form of oppression as being more important than another. Instead, they recognize that all forms of oppression, like oppression based on sex and gender, race, class, sexuality, they're all interwoven. This it really establishes that to deal with one form of oppression, we have to understand and challenge all forms of oppression. So you can't really be a feminist and a racist at the same time, or be fighting racism but hating women simultaneously. Socialist feminism also establishes that women's labor is extremely important in society but also very overlooked. That ties into the concept of unpaid labor and establishes that women's labor is uh, often overlooked and belittled. Continued, the final slide. Socialist feminism emphasizes that women in the workplace face more challenges that are also overlooked, like discrimination in hiring, where you have a large number of men in one profession, but a very small number of women in that same profession, or a large proportion of women in one profession, but a small number of men in that same profession. Um, the pay gap, men getting paid more for the same jobs where women are getting paid less, and also sexual harassment. Socialist feminism also criticizes the larger labor movement in being complicit in addressing women's issues in the workplaces. They also criticize it for being concerned with only economic issues. That this also could lead to further issues like opportunism and abandonment of the overall movement of the labor movement. That also, sorry, my recording cut out again. But as I was saying, this being concerned with only the economic issues of the labor movement uh, can lead to further issues like opportunism and abandonment of the overall movements. Lenin talks about this in his Left Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder book, criticizing opportunism. So that is the final slide. I hope I effectively explained feminism and Marxism and socialism and how all of them tie into each other. And I also hope that I effectively covered socialist feminism and Marxist perspectives of gender and gender relations. Thank you.